Hello everyone, and welcome back to our lecture mini-series covering Chapter 18, which is, of course, the endocrine system. And for those of you taking an Anatomy and Physiology course, this would be likely the second semester of Anatomy and Physiology. However, of course, if you're taking a general overview of Anatomy and Physiology, this will be a great lecture, but probably contain a little bit more details than you might need to know if you're doing a one-semester course here. But anyways, moving on to the pituitary gland, and we've already seen from part one, we've seen the hypothalamus, we've seen that that's a master gland. So we're going to reiterate some of those key points. And as I've stressed, this gland and this sort of connection is one of the harder ones to understand because we're literally talking about hormones. Notice these are the releasing hormones. They're produced by the hypothalamus. Notice that literally will trigger a hormone to be released from the anterior lobe, and that's what they're showing. Then the anterior lobe secretes a hormone. So here it's thyroid stimulating hormone, which targets the thyroid gland. And then that hormone, when it hits the thyroid gland, that'll stimulate the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones into the blood. And then these thyroid hormones actually carry out the response, which is regulating metabolism, right? You remember going back to one of the earlier lectures, I talked about the big overview of certain glands and what they do, and the thyroid, of course, was regulate metabolism. So that's kind of the cascade. This is a hormone cascade. We got one hormone triggering the release of another. We got a second hormone triggering the release of a third hormone, and then the third hormone is the one that actually carries out. So TRH is a hormone, TSH is a hormone, and then thyroid hormone causes the effects. That's why I was stressing that this is kind of a little bit more complex, which is why in part 2 of lecture 1, I went over and kind of did a general overview of the glands and their functions so you have a better idea of like what hormones big picture do, and that's why I spent a lot of time with insulin and glucagon, right? It was to show you that some hormones are as simple as saying, hey, this hormone causes cells to absorb glucose. Well, we're not going to see that here, so this gets into a little bit more complexity as you should have been seeing, but let's continue on with this. All right, so we're at part 2, so these are the main sort of objectives that I created that I think you would be going through. So, but let's get into this. All right, and so if you notice, I'm still using the same figure that we've been just going over because you can see the hypothalamus is linked to the pituitary gland. They're right next to each other. So pituitary gland, you should also know it as the hypophysis. And when it comes to dual terms, it's fair game for me to use them. In anatomy, it's really, really important that you get familiar with, I'm going to stress perspective a lot because perspectives change things. If you look at a sagittal cut versus, a transverse cut, two very different perspectives on things, similarly approaching the lecture from an organ-based level versus approaching it from the cellular level, two very different things. And just to give you an overview of what I mean by this perspective, just think about if I said, hey, what does the pancreas do? Well, that's a big organ perspective, and the pancreas, as far as a endocrine organ goes, it's going to regulate blood glucose levels, right? Because it secretes insulin and glucagon. But at the cellular level, which is a different perspective, if I said the beta cells, you need to know insulin specifically. And you need to know that that's going to cause a reduction in blood glucose by stimulating the cell. So that's what I mean by perspective. There's various ways I can ask questions, and I can ask them at the various levels. And so you need to pay attention when I say that. And so pituitary gland is a fair sort of term for me to use. Same with hypophysis. You should be familiar with both, okay? But pituitary gland, it's the vice president of the endocrine system. All right, it releases 9 peptide hormone. Now notice the key word I used here was release. I didn't say produces, and I'm going to stress this later, but notice it releases 9 peptide hormones. So I've been stressing most hormones are peptide. And because it's a peptide hormone, we're starting to build off of some of the minor concepts that are going to build up at the end here. I mentioned this concept of peptide hormones and where do they bind. Well, remember, receptors can be located either inside the cell or on the cell's plasma membrane, which would be out on the outer side. And since it's a peptide hormone, hopefully you're able to come up with that they're going to bind to extracellular receptors. These were the receptors on the outside of the cell. So if you forgot what extracellular receptors are, or if you don't like the fact that I abbreviated extracellular, make sure you fill that all out on your notes. And then off to the side here, if you don't know what this is, you would just put receptors that sit on the plasma membrane and stick outside of the cell. Extracellular is outside of the cell. All right, and what this means is if it binds extracellular receptors, it's going to likely use something called CAMP, and we're going to get to this. We're building to this concept, but we're going to be relying on a second messenger. And CAMP, basically what this is, just like ATP causes the cells to have energy, well, CAMP is basically the second messenger that will cause the cell to carry out whatever the hormone's response is. And I know that's a little weird. We're saying, hey, CAMP is going to carry out the responses. Does it change? And there's a few second messengers, but the main point is this CAMP in almost every cell is usually going to stimulate the cell by activating enzymes. We're going to get to that, so don't get too caught up on this yet. If that was confusing you, just ignore that for now. All right, but here's anatomical description. Which of the following organs sits inferior to the hypothalamus? That's what HT stands for, is hypothalamus. So again, if you need to write that on your notes, circle that and put that off to the side. And you should definitely know this lies within the cella turcica, the sphenoid. That was one of the structures I know I stressed to my students during the first semester of anatomy, that you should know the sphenoid bone, and you should know that specific groove in that sphenoid, the cella turcica. If you forgot what the sphenoid is, it's not a huge detail to know, but definitely cella turcica sitting in there, that would be something I would expect students to know, because, again, anatomical description. All right, the little stalk that connects the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland together, you should know, is known as the infundibulum. In fact, for me as an instructor, I have a model, and these models aren't really the greatest of models because they're really just kind of a flat board and a little projection, so it's not like you're actually holding a true model of the brain or anything like that. But I do have a model that looks very similar to this, and often if I point to this region, I expect students to know it's the infundibulum. You can see there's a term called pars tuberalis. I never label that, so those of you that are in my specific class, pars tuberalis usually gets you half credit at best, but usually I'm pretty specific saying, hey, what's the stalk-like structure being pointed at here? And I usually on the model will have an arrow pointing there, and then a second sticker with an arrow pointing there, and it's clear as day. If I'm pointing to this, I'm looking for infundibulum. All right. We have two distinct lobes of the pituitary gland, so this is where complexity comes in. This is why organization and you redoing your notes and really being active and actively engaged in your note taking is super important. Research shows that writing notes, taking notes, reorganizing, and truly what that is just really critical thinking on your part is going to have these long effects. So now we're taking the hypophysis, and we're going to break that down even deeper. All right, so now we have the anterior pituitary, and that's this darker region, and it's darker because this is actually more glandular-like material, where here we're going to see that this is quite a bit of the neural tissue, right? If you remember, the hypothalamus has the cell bodies of neurons sitting here, and the axon terminals reside here, which is why it has a lighter color. It's because we're dealing mostly with neural tissue, where here we're dealing with true glandular tissue, which glandular tissue, if you remember, is epithelial. So this is more neural based, this is more epithelial, which is pretty unique. All right, but anterior pituitary, notice it produces and secretes 7 hormones, and so it does produce 7 total hormones. All right, but notice we have 3 distinct histological regions, and you can see these are the histological regions, and this is why I stress perspective matters. For me, I stress these things. Other instructors might not be so big on this and might give you multiple options for putting answers. But for me, and the way I stress, when we look at histology, these are the terms that are acceptable, not anterior and posterior pituitary. Now on the board model or any model that I have, if I use a board model and I label up the anterior pituitary and you put that, you're going to get full credit. Perspective matters, and for me, histologically, these are histological layers that I would expect students to know. So pars distalis, that's going to be this one here, and then we're going to have something back here called pars nervosa. We're going to get into that. I'm just stressing out continuing to point out what I mean by perspective matters. All right, but as far as the posterior pituitary go, it secretes 2 hormones. Notice it produces 0. I stress this. This is exam-related questions that you should really know. In fact, you're going to have a Pearson assignment from me, and on there, they do one of the questions that they do, which is kind of they do a little bit of a bad job on, is they do say it says produces 9 hormones, and it's not. It should be 7. So if you get that homework problem and you're like, hey, Mr. C was stressing it only produces 7, that's absolutely correct. It's acceptable to say that this gland, overall, the pituitary gland, secretes 9. So notice the word secrete is fine to say it secretes 9 hormones. It only produces 7 of the 9. All right, but it does secrete 9 total. All right, so the posterior pituitary, one distinct region as far as the histological region goes, and that's called pars nervosa. And so we're going to be looking at the histology eventually, and those things will start to make more sense once we start seeing that. All right, so this is the anterior pituitary we're looking at. It's also known as the adenohypophysis. So this is more on the, this is where we have the glandular secretions. Now, if you remember, these are the releasing hormones that I said you needed to know. So TRH, CRH, and GnRH. Those were, if you remember, thyrotropin releasing hormones. And then we had corticotropin and then gonadotropin. Notice tropic hormones, those are hormones that cause the release of other hormones. All right, but there are inhibiting, and you can see there's something called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. There's prolactin inhibiting hormone as well. I don't focus on those, so you should know that inhibiting hormones exist, but as far as test material, you're not going to necessarily see that as a correct answer. I never use those as correct answers. I don't ask about inhibiting hormones besides saying, hey, which thing can cause a reduction in the secretion and production of a hormone, and you would just need to know inhibiting hormones as a generic, not any of these specifics by any means. All right, but anterior pituitary, these are the hormones you need to go through and note. Notice they have the target and they have the hormonal effect. You should be able to recognize these three and what they cause the release of. So hands down, know your 3 examples, TRH, CRH, GnRH. That was from part 1 of lecture 2, because that was all, this is all hypothalamic hormones. So make sure you understand how you're using this figure. All right, all of these hormones, if it isn't clear, and I did stress this on the previous part as well, these are all peptide hormones, which means they're binding to extracellular receptors. So this is what the histology will end up looking like. Okay, and you can see it's very light. The lighter side is always going to be the posterior pituitary. The darker side will always be pars distalis, which would be the anterior lobe. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. But before we do that, this table is what you need to know. However you want to organize this and their functions, that is up to you. You need to know TRH stimulates the release of thyroid stimulating hormone, which is an anterior pituitary hormone. Okay, so this is the anterior. All of these are anterior pituitary hormones. If you notice, they talk about pars distalis and pars intermedia. I don't really spend too much time with those regions. If you're taking a course with a different instructor and they are stressing that you know the distinct regions as far as what hormone is released from them, I would know them. As far as I'm concerned, I expect you to know that these hormones are released from the anterior pituitary. Okay, you don't need to get caught up on pars distalis or pars intermedia. All right, but those of you, if your instructor wants you to know that in a different course, pars distalis is your best answer, because notice 6 of the 7 are going to be secreted. Anyway, TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, and yes, if you're wondering, do I abbreviate things on the exam, you're probably going to see, as far as answer choices go, I'll spell it as thyroid stimulating hormone, and then I usually put the abbreviations next to it. So on my exams, you're likely going to see both the abbreviation and the full name. On lab exams where you write things out, I usually accept most abbreviations during a hormone-based sort of lectures or a hormone lab exam, but once we get into identification of like structures, I expect students to write the full thing out, and I'll talk about that later, so I don't want to get too off track. Anyway, know these, be able to recognize these. So TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, it targets the thyroid gland, and this is a tropic hormone. So notice it stimulates the secretion of thyroid hormones when this binds. So without TSH, our thyroid gland will not release thyroid hormones. All right, so thyroid stimulating hormone stimulates the thyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland will now secrete thyroid hormones. So that's the impact of TSH. It binds the thyroid gland, causes the release of thyroid hormones. All right, it's that simple. That's what you need to know. We don't get too much more detail than that. All right, then we get to ACTH, or adrenocorticotropic hormone. So notice this is telling you it's a tropic hormone. I do expect students to know it targets the adrenal cortex, and you do want to start getting familiar with something called the zona fasciculata. I know that's quite a complex term, but ACTH is really going to stimulate primarily the release of cortisol, cortisone, or corticosterone. All right, I usually use the terms cortisol and cortisone instead of glucocorticoids. I accept all these terms, I know them, but on my exams for my students, the terms I would learn is cortisol and cortisone and or glucocorticoids. All right, but notice the hormone that causes this release of ACTH is corticotropin releasing hormone. So don't forget this, the cascade is hypothalamus releases this, that targets the anterior pituitary. Now once this binds to the anterior pituitary, it stimulates the release of ACTH. ACTH is going to bind to the region called the zona fasciculata, and it's going to cause the release of cortisol, which is a stress hormone. It's the stress metabolic hormone, and all this should make sense because the stress is going to be stimulated and released by starting at the hypothalamus. So when we get stressed, the hypothalamus is kind of the brainstem region where we sort of deal with stress in that region. It can sort of amp us up, and we should know that because, of course, the hypothalamus also sends signals to the adrenal gland. So this is kind of the same thing, except this is targeting, when we talk sympathetic stimulation, that's the epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is the stress response. So when we're stressed and getting anxious about things, this is the hormone trigger in the hormone cascade. All right, then we go to the gonads. And so when we get here, notice we have FSH, we have LH, okay? Now, to be clear on this, we're going to expand on this much, much later. But notice if it targets ovaries or testes, ovaries or mammary gland, ovaries or testes, and then notice testes again here. If it's targeting these, the cascade is going to start with gonadotropic releasing hormone. This is a hypothalamic hormone that triggers the release of FSH and LH. Now, what I test on early in the semester is pretty basic. I expect students to know that FSH for females will target the ovaries, for males will target the testes, and all I want you to note, okay, is it's going to stimulate the egg development here. Okay, here it says follicle development. As the follicle develops, that's what nurtures the egg. So helps stimulate the follicle development and egg development. And then for the testes, know that it stimulates sperm development. We're going to just keep it that simple. All right, for LH, what I would expect my students to know is LH targets the ovaries and stimulates ovulation. Okay, notice LH, as far as this goes, I don't really care that you know it causes the secretion of testosterone. We're not getting into too many of those details at this point. We're going to say that at the end of the semester, we go into the reproductive system, and when we go into the reproductive system, these details will need to be well understood and well known. Okay, but for now, so again, to be clear, FSH targets the ovaries for females, targets the testes for males. When it targets the ovaries, that causes follicle and egg development. You can put egg development. Without the follicles developing, the egg will not develop. That's all there is to it. So follicle and egg development, follicle stimulating hormone, follicle and egg. For males, it stimulates sperm development. I know it says sperm maturation, but we're going to need this. We're going to get into those specific details. This is a nice overview, and it's very simple. We're going to keep it simple for now. All right. Don't need to know about LH for males, but you do need to know LH is what causes ovulation. And we're just going to keep it that simple. Now, prolactin, you should know, targets mammary glands, and this is one that I definitely test on. You need to know prolactin is milk production. You don't need to know there's prolactin releasing factor or prolactin inhibiting hormone. You do not need to know this part of the cascade. So know that targets mammary glands for production, which is different than milk release. Oxytocin is milk release. Oxytocin is produced by the hypothalamus, but released from the posterior pituitary. All right, so definitely know. On the exam, I'm telling you, I have pretty much a joint question often. I say blank stimulates milk production and blank stimulates milk release, or vice versa. And prolactin stimulates milk production. Oxytocin stimulates milk release. All right, growth hormone, you can see it targets all the cells of the body, and what it does is it stimulates protein synthesis, notice lipid mobilization, i.e. it stimulates growth, as the name suggests. Again, you don't need to know the hormone, the releasing and inhibiting hormones by any means. All right, the final hormone is melanocyte stimulating hormone. As that name suggests, it targets the melanocytes, and that causes them to start synthesizing more melanin. All right, so these are very straightforward. But you need to practice this. All right, there's students struggle in this area because they don't practice this enough. These are questions you want to make sure you get right. What I would recommend you do is you just get in the habit of going over this chart. You don't even need to invest a lot of critical thinking behind this. You should just go through this chart saying thyroid stimulating, targets thyroid, causes secretion. And if you do that like 4 to 5 times, you'll probably have this down, what their functions are. And again, all of these hormones are peptide hormones that were mentioned in here. So make sure you have that down because classification is absolutely critical. All right, so then we go into the posterior pituitary. So this is the anterior pituitary. We're wrapping up with the posterior pituitary. Notice neurohypophysis, and that's because notice unmyelinated axons of the hypothalamic neurons end up reaching this region, and that's where they're being produced. So notice posterior lobe. These are hormones that are secreted. Okay, notice hypothalamic regulatory hormones, none. They're transported along specific nuclei to the posterior lobe. All right, so notice stores and releases, and I'm stressing doesn't produce 2 hormones. Like I said, if Pearson didn't fix that question, you might see Pearson saying the pituitary gland produces 9 hormones. That would be incorrect because, again, posterior doesn't produce these. It just stores them as we see here. All right, you should have already known these. We went over these because they were hypothalamic produced hormones, but ADH, notice reabsorption of water, elevation of blood volume and blood pressure, i.e. you should know that ADH is secreted when we have low blood pressure or low blood volume. All right, that's the main point. You need to know ADH. As I said, I do a lot of questions throughout the entire semester. Which of the following hormones increases or decreases blood pressure? ADH will definitely increase blood pressure and is secreted when we have low blood pressure. Low blood pressure is way, way more dangerous than high blood pressure. All right, and not that high blood pressure is good, but low blood pressure is dangerous because literally you can pass out from it. All right, oxytocin is the other one, and that targets, of course, the mammary glands, like I said, for milk ejection. But notice labor and contractions. You should know those two for the females. Here, I really don't get into this. I don't really talk about oxytocin for males. We're not really, I save these kind of things for, I said, like for the 4th unit and final unit. So for now, oxytocin, uterus, mammary glands for labor contractions and milk ejection. The final detail that you need to know is you need to know what specific nuclei, and when we use nuclei of the brain, remember, these are like command centers or processing centers. So the supraoptic nuclei, that's going to be what produces ADH. And ADH is considered a vasopressin, which means it helps retain water or helps increase blood pressure. All right, the other nuclei, as you can see, we look here, is the paraventricular nuclei. So the paraventricular nuclei, that's going to be your oxytocin. All right, paraventricular oxytocin. All right, but these are the major hormones to note here. The final bullet point here on the slide is just an introduction to a concept we're going to get to on part 3. But what carries this? So if you're like, well, these are hypothalamic hormones and we're using neurons, and if we're using neurons, how is it considered a hormone? Well, it's considered a hormone because the actual axon terminals, those axon terminals drain and dump into the bloodstream. So there's something that we're going to learn. It's called the inferior hypophyseal portal system. That's what HPS is, hypophyseal portal system. This is the hypophysis, hypophyseal. So that inferior hypophyseal portal system is what is going to carry these hormones from the posterior pituitary gland into general circulation in the bloodstream. So that's why these are hormones. It's because they're carried in the bloodstream, even though you would think, hey, it's an axon terminal, it's got to be a neurotransmitter. But the fact that it's in the blood, makes it a hormone. All right, and we've been mentioning the 2 types of hormone receptors, so just kind of reiterating the tough concept that we're eventually going to get to. So remember, hormone receptors are membrane proteins. Now, when I say membrane, I didn't say plasma membrane. It can be membrane of like, if you remember, your mitochondria is made up of dual membranes. Well, it can be those sort of membranes, but these are membrane proteins that are able to bind specific hormones, and when they bind those hormones, it results in cellular changes. If there isn't a receptor for that hormone, there's no effect. This is why different hormones reach different areas, is because those hormones have to have, or those organs and their targets have to have these receptors. And so different cells have different receptors, and cells in general have lots and lots of receptors. And these different receptors can cause different responses. What's interesting is that those secondary messengers, as we're going to see and talk about, they tend to be the same. It's just a matter of what that triggers, what hormones does it activate on, or hormones, what enzymes does that usually activate on the inside of the cell. All right, we're going to get to that later. All right, but tissues can have unique combinations of receptors, and this is how one hormone can have varying effects from one tissue versus another. It's based on the types of receptors and what those receptors do, and if they open and allow one object in versus another. Again, a concept we're going to be getting to later. I don't want this to be overwhelming when we get there, so I'm kind of introducing you to some of the tougher things. But this is the main point. This is what you need to know moving forward in the lecture, and what I would consider, for me and my students, fair game for me to test on. You need to know there's extracellular receptors, and these are receptors on the plasma membrane surface, which means these are on the outer surface of the cell. So extracellular is outside of the cell because, truly speaking, it's not internal. It's on the surface. All right, and this is where water-soluble hormones are going to bind. That means peptide hormones and most amino acid derivative. That's what this means, amino acid derivative hormones bind there. The exception to the amino acid derivative would be thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone is a tyrosine derivative, if you remember, but that one was lipid soluble. All the other amino acid derivatives are water soluble. All right, and then we have intracellular. The word intra is the key here. You see the prefix here. Intra means inside. So these are receptors on membranes, on membranes inside the cell. They're receptors on membranes. All right, so I just wanted to take care of that really quick. Intracellular receptors are receptors on membranes that are inside the cell. So think, you should be thinking like the rough ER, the smooth ER, the Golgi apparatus, the mitochondria. All of those were made up of the lipid bilayer, which is what a membrane is. It's anything that's composed of a lipid bilayer forms the membrane. And so we have intracellular receptors that are going to be found there. And so these are going to be all of our lipid-soluble hormones, which means they're going to be our steroid derivative hormones as well as thyroid hormone. Okay. For now, these are the major points to note. If you start getting this down, when we get to the tough concept, which I'm saving for the very last lecture or close to it, that's where you'll have to really start applying this content. All right, so that takes us on through the second basic group note review. At this point, you should be able to answer these questions without too much trouble here. Now, I say that's, of course, after studying, you should be able to get through that. But this was really the two questions. If after listening to the lecture, do you feel confident being able to answer these? If you don't, clearly there was quite a few things that you missed, or this is the first time you listen to a lecture, which means you got studying to do before these questions become easier to really understand. So the goal should be to kind of review this content and then refer back to this group note review. Could you answer these? If so, then I would say you got that content down and can move on to part 3, or you still can move along onto part 3. Just understand you really should be able to answer all of these by the time the second lecture ends. All right, but that's going to end our second part. We have the third and final part of this coming up, so look out for that one. Obviously, I'm going on to 30 minutes here. This was a little bit longer. Hopefully, the next one will be a little bit briefer. We're going to be getting into the histology side, which is really the lab component. All right, thank you all for listening. Look out for the next part to wrap up Chapter 18, Lecture 2. Take care, everyone.